Hello everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today. We're going to be talking about pivot tables, and our host, Dennis Taylor, has over 25 years of computer software teaching experience throughout the U.S. and Canada. In addition to being the author-presenter of over 400 webinars on various Excel topics since 2006, he has also co-authored or authored 6 books on spreadsheet software. Dennis has taught over 500 public Excel seminars and thousands of Excel classes and workshops. He's also been the author-presenter of numerous Excel video DVD courses since the mid-1990s and has over 80 hours of online Excel training. Dennis?
Thank you, Joe, and hello, everyone. One of Excel's most exciting features is called a pivot table. It's the ideal tool for analyzing large amounts of information. If you work with large lists, like the list that I have here, which is about 900 rows, you're trying to make some sense out of it. And there's no question that these days we're getting inundated with data, and 900 rows isn't exactly that large for some people. I've seen much larger lists than this one. What do we do to manage data? In Excel, on the Data tab in the ribbon, we certainly use sorting a lot. This list is not sorted, but certainly it would help if we're trying to focus on just one product or one customer. And filter is even more effective when it comes to analyzing our data, at least in terms of seeing just the data that we want. And the subtotal command, also found on the data ribbon, has its strengths too. It allows us to take a sorted list and introduce subtotals at certain breakpoints. Those are the 3 basic tools that many people use when they're working with large amounts of data. But if you're trying to come up with some really good analysis, in other words, some summary information, say like a subtotal gives you, but in addition to have some flexibility for displaying the information quickly in different layouts, nothing beats a pivot table. Now, you can't say I've got a bunch of data and therefore I've got this pivot table feature that I've heard so much about. It's going to let me analyze all this information quickly. Source data for a pivot table needs to be structured, and in a certain sense it's pretty simple. In this list here, there are no empty rows. I could scroll all the way to the bottom, but I've checked out ahead of time. There are no empty rows in this list, nor are there any empty columns. It's also very efficient if your titles are in a single row. And this is true when you work with sorting and filtering and subtotal. Perhaps you've encountered that concept already. We might have empty cells. In this particular set of data, we don't, but that's not uncommon, and sometimes it's totally appropriate based on the content. So we want to make some sense out of this. Think of a pivot table as a separate entity that we're about to create, much in the same way that a chart is a separate entity. If someone came to you and said, I see your list here, could you give me a quick summary based on salesperson and region? We want to know how many items each salesperson has sold by region. So off to the right here, I've actually done this manually. Think of how you might do this manually, working with standard Excel features outside of a pivot table. Nice alphabetized list here, got our regions across the top, but let's take a look at one of these formulas here. I'm going to double click on cell J4 right here. Take a look at that. Isn't that a lot of fun? And even if I scroll to the right a little bit, okay, it makes it slightly better, but that is not easy to set up. And furthermore, when you do set it up, you want to be sure that it's right, and so you might have to do some cross-checking there. Imagine if we were using this in a sales meeting. It gives us good information. The discussion at some point maybe has reached its course, reached the end of the discussion, so somebody else has already brought up the idea here, how easy would it be, or could we see the products here? Well, give me 15 minutes and I'll get back to you. If we were using these kinds of formulas here, it's not easy. We don't have flexibility really to come up with a different list here. And sure enough, as you start thinking of some of those fields there and the different combinations that we have, we could compare salesperson with product and product with region and customer with region and so on and so on and so on. Not to mention date, different items, different amounts, a lot of different cross comparisons we'd like to make here. And trying to do them quickly is not going to be easy, except by way of a pivot table. Now, without overselling the concept, we could create this pivot table in about 5 seconds and no formulas, simply based on this data here. Now, based on what I had said earlier, you would expect that the pivot table feature is going to be found on the Data tab, but it's not. It's on the Insert tab. Now remember, prerequisites are, we've got our list here, there are no empty rows within it, no empty columns. You don't even have to highlight all the data. And a lot of you familiar with sorting and filtering know that when your data is together like this, provided you've got an empty row on the right, or one above it if you've got anything above this, if your data is all together there, you need only click on one cell. Let's go to the Insert tab in the ribbon and choose Pivot Table. Quick description there, easily arrange and summarize complex data in a pivot table. Let's do it. The Create Pivot Table dialog box, if we simply go with its defaults and click OK, we will automatically get a new pivot table, empty one of course for starting, on a different worksheet. A quick glance here is always appropriate. Excel nearly always gets this right. In other words, it's figured out that our data here is from row 3 down to row 912, columns A through G. We'll click OK, and we'll be on a new sheet. And off to the left, we see what, for a better term, might be called a pivot table placeholder. Off to the right, now this is usually anchored, but here's a list of the pivot table fields that we just saw. You can leave this anchored to the right here, or you can, if you point to pivot table fields, click and drag this, put it this way, and then perhaps make it larger. I tend to prefer it floating. The other term, by the way, sometimes is docked, but you can either leave it in its other position or here. If you want to take it back to the way we saw it before, double-click the title bar. Different ways to manipulate the data. Now, increasingly important, although not so obvious at first, are going to be these areas below. Now, I said we could do this in 5 seconds. Obviously, I'm talking, but let's say we're starting right now. We've gone through the initial click of choosing pivot table. We just went with the defaults. We clicked OK. 2 clicks and a drag, and we're there. Here's salesperson. Automatically, we see those names over on the left-hand side. I'm going to zoom in on there using the Control key and the mouse wheel just momentarily. And come back to our pivot table field list. I'm going to click the box for items. We're tracking items sold. And the last thing I'm going to do, a little bit different than the first two, is drag the word region into an area here called columns. Now, I could have done that faster, of course, but I did want to explain what I was doing along the way. And here's the same information we saw before. If I jump back to the previous sheet where our source data is, we see this 7999. Our top performer is Willie Lohman, 1064. We're seeing these same numbers in the pivot table. Within this pivot table, if we click one of the cells, it's not a formula, it's just raw data. You can see it up in the formula bar. We click in the grand total, same idea. We're down at the bottom here. Grand total, all these, just raw numbers. Now, the more you work with a pivot table, the more you need to become familiar with a few terms. And we see these terms on the pivot table itself, and yet I'm not sure we'd want to leave them there. If this is being prepared just for you, the term row labels and column labels are certainly okay. They're not in the way, and others could see them. Of course, there's nothing wrong with it. But it does reinforce the idea that in our pivot table field list over here to the right, in the lower portion we see the term rows, columns, and values. Also here another term called filters, which for the moment we're not using. You want to get familiar with the term column labels and row labels, and as we work with pivot tables, the lower portion of the pivot table field list here serves as a mapping of the pivot table. That may not be so obvious at first, but the more we work with pivot tables, the more we begin to rely upon this. And it doesn't have to be that large. You can shrink it, you can make it narrower, that sort of thing. The upper portion of it there, you can make narrower if you wish. So nothing too important about that, but it can be flexible, so to speak. Now, what if you were to use this in a presentation? I think the term row labels and column labels are probably not desirable. Now, already you might have noticed something else here different on the screen. If I click outside the pivot table, keep an eye out on the ribbon menu system. Now, right now we're seeing 2 new terms here, analyze and design, 2 new contextual tabs they're sometimes called. If I click outside the pivot table, that ribbon disappears, and so does the pivot table field list. Click back anywhere within pivot table. Our pivot table field list reappears, and the Analyze and Design contextual tabs appear. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as a pivot table tools ribbon, although most people I think refer to these tabs separately. The Analyze tab has features strictly related to pivot tables, and so does the Design tab. Although from time to time you will recognize certain features here that you might have seen elsewhere as well. Notice too on Analyze, when the Analyze tab is selected off to the right, we do see field list buttons, field headers here. If I click field list, it will remove the pivot table field list, which I think most people will not want to do, but occasionally people click that by mistake, and a little bit of panic there. Let's bring it back. Now, in order to not see row labels and column labels, what we need to do here is to go to the Design tab and choose a different report layout. Now, this is certainly not an obvious thing to do, and I wish this actually were part of the default where these were not showing. But nevertheless, on report layout, we can choose either outline form or tabular form. The current form right now is actually called compact form, and it doesn't really have any kind of obvious meaning at the moment. So I'm going to choose outline or tabular because both of these will show the field names that we have in our source data. There's outline data showing region and salesperson. The major difference here between outline and tabular is the tabular shows grid lines. We'll see another difference a bit later. So now I have grid lines. Now you can use standard Excel features, of course, if you think this is going to be better. If the rows are narrow, of course, click in the upper left-hand corner, double-click any column boundary, make those row or column widths different. And if you want to right align these, nothing major, of course on the Home tab, right align, that sort of thing. And you can use any other standard features you might want to. So we've got a pivot table here in pretty quick order. And again, imagine, as I suggested, this idea, you're doing this at a sales meeting. This discussion about the display here of the numbers has pretty much run its course, and somebody suggested, could we do this with product? Let's not show region. So we can uncheck the box for region and drag in product and put it in the columns area. And now we see those. Sometimes you have to move this off to the right. A quick readjustment of the column widths. Click in the upper left corner, double-click a column boundary. There we go. Makes it a little tighter on the display. Same total as before. Willie Loman still has 1064, but maybe some of those lower numbers are causing some discussion about why this number is so low, why that number is so low, and so on. Again, you can imagine just wanting to see the data. Sometimes, of course, it's not about a meeting. It's about information on a sheet of paper that you're going to be distributing to people. And we can have, by the way, multiple pivot tables based on the same data. Now, another person looking at this might say, well, I remember a few years ago, we had created a list like this manually. I'm not sure how it was done, but we had region down the left-hand side. Let's do that instead of salesperson. Could we show region and product? Well, let's uncheck the box for salesperson. And if you click a box here for a field that's a text field, and region is a text field, click the box here, it will automatically appear in the row area, in the rows area right here as we see it. And there's product that way. And someone else has said, you know, earlier we saw region and salesperson, but could we show region and salesperson with the salespersons as a column? Let's uncheck the box for product and drag salesperson into the columns area. That's not so efficient, even if we readjust the column widths. Now, part of what we're seeing here is this idea that, wow, we could go back and forth with, we got 5 or 6 different fields here. If we start putting them in different positions here, we've got a ton of different options. And it's certainly, I think we're reaching a point where we might be saying, even if we're brand new here, some of these are pretty good, and some of these, we got to scroll back and forth. These are not all great choices here. Now, the word pivot really isn't used very much, but just to bring up the idea of a pivot table comes from this concept. We're looking at a list here like this. What if we somehow could say, let's take this list that we can't quite see all of unless we zoom back. Let's take this list here and somehow pivot it from the upper left-hand corner so that we've got our salesperson's names down the side, the region across the top. Well, there is no single action called pivot, but it's actually a combination of actions, and nobody really makes too much of a point of it, but it does, again, bring out this idea of flexibility. Let's bring salesperson from its column areas location into the row areas, it's called rows area. There we are, and now we've got a list like this. Now, that's not exactly compact, but on the other hand, that might have merit. But we'll just leave it there for the moment and put region, move it from the rows area into columns area, and we see this layout. And we saw that one earlier too. So the word pivot, again, we don't really obsess over it, but it just brings up the concept of where this idea comes from. Pivoting the data simply by switching the row and column labels area. Now, based on what you've seen so far, you might make the assumption that pivot tables are about comparing two fields, or in a certain sense 3 fields here because we've got the numbers, but we're not limited to this. And we saw momentarily there how salesperson and region could be used together as row labels, both of them in the rows area. So I'm going to drag region into rows this way. We saw that, although earlier we saw it in a different combination. Salesperson and region were in reverse order. But let's bring in product now and make it a columns area label. And now we've got this list. Now, if we're thinking about a presentation in front of a live audience, this is not probably the ideal kind of display because it's just too much information. Again, the term is a little, somewhat subjective, and we don't always agree necessarily, but I think many times when you're setting up a pivot table, you're setting it up either for just your own personal analysis, you're looking at the information, trying to pick up something that's telling you something new maybe, or maybe you're about to print it for distribution purposes, or maybe you're about to make a presentation. I think at different times we kick around the data in different ways to think of what we're going to be doing with this. As we look at this data here, recognize, once again, product, as we see the products here, are represented in our pivot table field list as a columns area item. There's products right there. In the row labels area, we're seeing salesperson and region. Recognize that the top-down order there, salesperson and region, is reflected by the left to right order in the actual pivot table. Salesperson is here, region is there. So we see the correlation between the two. You may or may not want the subtotals there. On the Design tab, the Contextual tab, remember this appears only when the active cells are within the pivot table, we have a choice here called Subtotals. And we might choose Do Not Show Subtotals. At other times, of course, you might want to show them. Now, once again, going back to this idea, we see salesperson and region as 2 different items here in the rows area here. I'm going to drag salesperson downward, put it below region, and watch the pivot table display change. Same number of rows probably, or almost the same, and yet the breakout's different. Of course, there's some empty cells from time to time, as we see here. And I think you're getting the idea, if you're brand new to this, the incredible flexibility that we have here. And along the way, seeing some bad choices too. And of course, we won't stick with those. We'll just find a better layout. And part of this for some people will be, you're an analyst, you're trying to come up with information that's really giving us the big picture here, the story that you somehow have a sense. And think too how important it is when it's your data. This is not your data, this is sample data. But when it's your data, you've got some certain instincts, some thoughts about what's important and what's not. And we've got lots of variation here. And instead of showing the sum of items here, we might want to show instead the dollar amount. By the way, in addition to simply unchecking the box for items, we can simply drag it off the list here, do it this way. Our pivot table doesn't show very much right now. I'm going to click the box for amount. Now these are dollar amounts, and that certainly is not an ideal way to read them in terms of how we read numbers. So a quick check here, right-click any one of these cells and choose number format. And let's say in the example here, probably the best choice, although there's certainly some options, the number tab, or the category under number tab called number, Decimal places, we don't need them here, but certainly commas are going to help immensely in terms of readability. And there we are. So if we were showing amounts, I think almost obviously, first adjustment is to make the commas be present as well. Now, we might come back to this pivot table, but I do want to show other kinds of data as well here too, and also the idea that, and you might have assumed this too, that pivot tables are always on a separate sheet. They're not. I think many times they are, and I tend to put them on separate sheets from the source data. But there will be times when it makes perfect sense, and maybe it might even be the norm for you to put a pivot table on the same data as the source data. So I'm going to go to a different sheet here called Employees, and I'll zoom back a little bit. We can take a look at this list here. This is about 700 rows. By the way, when you've got the active cell on top of your data, a quick way to get to the bottom, you can double-click the bottom edge of the active cell, take you down to the bottom here, and this row 742 is the bottom. This data, as you can see, is sorted by department. And what might we want to get out of this? Now, once again, when you know your data, you don't even have to stop and think. You know some certain things you're looking for here. Some people might say, let's see how much each department is spending on compensation. That would make sense. Let's break it out by status as well here. Another person might be interested in the job rating and how that correlates. If it does it correlate with years of experience? Someone else might want to know how many people are in each building here. Can we see a breakout by building here? It's in column B. A building breakout by department. So any number of different things. Let's create a pivot table on this worksheet and actually have it on the same worksheet as the source data. And let's imagine that we did want to tabulate the amount of compensation by department, by status. Recognize that unlike the earlier source data that we saw for the previous pivot table, there are empty cells in column I. And you can tell by the heading here, some of them are always going to be empty. Some people don't get benefits. Hourly employees, contract employees typically don't. So no benefits here on some of these, and empty cells are just fine. Within this list, there are no empty rows, there are no empty columns. We want to create a pivot table, but different than the last time, we want it on the same worksheet. Insert tab, pivot table. Now, what was different this time? And I didn't do this on purpose, by the way, but it does bring out an issue. I had two cells highlighted. Excel can't quite figure out what's going on here, so I'll just do a quick cancel. Either click one cell or highlight all the data. And if you know your data is all together in one solid cluster, no reason to highlight it. Now, new in Excel 2013, not available in older versions, you might want to pursue recommended pivot tables. And this gives you some thoughts about the kinds of data that you might want to create in a new pivot table. Different choices here. I have from time to time have found this useful, but I think in this case maybe not as good, but nevertheless it could be a starting point. So let me actually take one of these here, and I don't want to work on job rating. Department, benefits, summary, sum of job rating. It seems to focus on job rating more than I would. Compensation, there's the one. I think we'll start with this one. Sum of compensation right here. By status. Count of employee names, sum of benefits. You might not have even thought of some of these. So I'm going to go with this one right here and simply click OK. And look what happens. It automatically puts the pivot table on a new sheet to the left of the source data. Now, once you see it, you might say, well, that's not really something I want. Here's that pivot table field list all set up for us. And we can remove fields from here and essentially start over if we want to. I did want to bring out the idea that this was present, and I'm not necessarily saying it's not a good feature, but you'll just have to experiment with it a little bit because some of the suggestions could be right. And this same kind of feature, by the way, also new in Excel 2013, is available with charts. So I'm going to go back to the actual data here and start off and to create what I initially suggested, this idea that we want a pivot table off to the right, same worksheet, that's going to show us a breakout of compensation by department and status. insert. Now the active cell now is in one cell too. Insert pivot table. It recognizes the data, goes from A1 over to column J and down to row 742. Choose where you want the pivot table data to be placed. Existing worksheet. Click on the location panel. I'm going to click on cell L1 and then OK. And scrolling rightward here, we've got our pivot table fields, our pivot table placeholder. I'm simply going to click department. Now, department is a text field. It's got about 25 different departments in this particular list here. Putting it in the column area is going to make that awfully wide. So very often, and particularly since it's a text field anyway, simply check the box here. This will go into the rows area below. There we are. Status, put it as columns, and let's track compensation. And we got a ton of numbers here. Always check out your list as you see it here. Now, in this list, fortunately, nobody misspelled environmental, but if someone had, we'd see that as a separate entry there. As we move down the list here, eventually we might see something else here. What's this? It looks like maybe we do have a correction to make here. Project and contract services. We see the difference, of course. It looks like only one of them is here. We've got one cell or one entry here that is misspelled. So let's correct this right now. And we're going to be in for a surprise here too. This list farther down in the list here, we can actually scroll down a bit faster probably. Project and contract services, there we are, and there's the offending item. I'll simply drag this downward to make it the same. So our pivot table is all set, right? No, it isn't. And this is a surprise if you have not worked with pivot tables before. Probably on the first day of Excel, when you learned how to write formulas, it was probably drummed into you that when you change a cell that's being used by a formula, the formula reacts immediately. And when you work with charts, if you change the source data, what happens to the chart? It changes immediately. So what happened here in the pivot table? Here's a pivot table based on data that the source data, which is off to the left, we made a change there. What happened here? Nothing. The reason for this is that when you create a pivot table, actually what happens is your source data is stored or copied into what's called a cache, or that's C-A-C-H-E, a pivot table cache, and your pivot table is actually based on that. It's not based on the original source data. That sounds a little strange maybe, but there could be times when you want to make changes to your source data and you don't want your pivot table changed. And sometimes if you're making wholesale changes, and if you've got multiple pivot tables, that might even take some time. So the key thought here is when you make changes to your source data, the pivot table does not adjust until you adjust it. And the term we use here is called refresh. Right there's the button on the toolbar. Also a keystroke shortcut you can use, Alt F5. Now we don't have to select the cell, but I do want to more or less highlight it here so we can see it. We've got one problem here. That's a separate entry. It should not be a separate entry anymore. And if we update it, this number up above should go to what? About 442 or 4.2 million, I guess it is. Yeah, 4.2 million. So we'll simply click the button refresh. And you see the row disappear and the number has gone up. And now we're all set. So if we make changes to the source data, we must refresh the pivot table if we expect to be able to claim that it's in any way that it's up to date. All right, we need to change the numbers here. They're not looking so good. And also the row labels, column labels, I think we want to change as we did before. Let's do that first. Row labels, column labels. Remember, nothing truly wrong with them, and it does reinforce the idea as to where they are in the pivot table. And yet, most people wouldn't want to see them. It's the Design tab in the ribbon, Report Layout, Outline or Tabular. I tend to prefer tabular. I'll use it because it shows grid lines. Let's change these numbers. And by the way, thought here too. Right click. Earlier we'd done this with the previous example. We go to number format. And I think commas, of course, are what we want to see here. But here's another thought too. If you are familiar with a special custom format to show these numbers in thousands, you can use that. And that format will be, you can start with one of the simple formats that are already here. simply alter it by ending it in 0.0 comma. Now, this is not unique to pivot tables, and you can certainly use it at other times in Excel, but if you do use a format here that has a trailing comma in it, that will suppress the display of 3 characters to the left of the decimal. And that means we'll get this in thousands. Now, putting in a 0.0 isn't critical, but that's a common thing to do when you're displaying numbers this way, so I'll click OK. What I might also do here is highlight this so we can see it larger. In a second, I'll paste it into an empty cell. So highlighting it, pressing Control-C to copy it, and click OK. But we're about to see these numbers in thousands, and that could be easier to read. The display I'm using right now, I'll put it right here momentarily, is this. That's the format. I'll even make it there so I can see it. Yeah, that's the format I'm using there, a special custom format. If I had put in 2 trailing commas, these numbers would be in millions. That wouldn't be too advantageous based on the list here. But if you are working with large budget numbers, keep in mind that concept. So we're seeing numbers this way. Admittedly, it's a little bit unconventional, but certainly valuable and at least worth thinking about. Our numbers are, of course, accurate as we see them. It is a visual rounded display, so that's not quite accurate in one sense. If we want to do this in a more standard way, I'll simply right-click back into number format and choose, as we might have done before, number, no decimal places this time, use the commas, click OK. And now, for example, we're about to see that 282 is going to be 282,000, or maybe 281,900, something like that. So there we go, 281,975. This is probably the more typical display. But obviously, the commas are desirable, in fact, almost required, I think, by common standards here to see this data clearly and easily. Now, imagine if we're looking at this, what if you said, and I'll get rid of this, we don't need that anymore. What if we said, or what if we were thinking out loud and saying, you know, I'd like to see this data here sorted in descending order based on the grand total. Well, we can do this. And furthermore, we don't have to select the data the way I did here. I just did that to bring out what we might want to sort. And let me scroll to the right here so we can see that a little bit better. So there's the data we might want to sort. But all we need to do is to simply click in column Q here. And we can go to the Data tab, and actually they've taken it off the Analyze tab. It was there in the previous version of PivotTable, so you could see it there, but not in this version. Data tab, ZA. Now notice I've only clicked on one cell in column Q, and we can see ahead of time that manufacturing at 7.7 million is going to go to the top of the list. But simply by clicking on a single cell here, and then clicking the ZA button here, this is on the Data tab, sort descending, we're going to rearrange all those rows, but not the grand totals or anything. Not the grand total rows are separately. And so this data, of course, traveled together, and we have our list looking like this. At a later time, if we wanted to rearrange the list, I mean, someone might say, could you rearrange this list so that it's in order descending by full-time employees? It's going to be almost the same, but not quite. We'll just click somewhere in this column where we've got our full-time employees, and click ZA. And now we see the breakout there. And if we need to alphabetize it, of course, we'll just click over here in column L and hit the AZ button, start ascending. Now, based on what we've done so far, you might imagine that only values that in this values area here, that we're only dealing with one field. And probably most of the time you would be in a pivot table, but what if somebody else says, you know, I'd like to see accompanying this the head count as well. How many people do we have in each of these departments here? Now, employee name is a text field, but what if we put it in the values area? What's going to happen? Because it is text, it's pretty obvious we can't add text, but we can count, and that's exactly what we get here. A count of employee name. Now, the display right now, I think, is not ideal, and particularly we've got this unwieldy term, count of employee name. It sort of almost sounds like it's kind of a medieval title or something. I'm the count of employee names. That doesn't, yeah, we don't. That's way too unwieldy. Why don't we just put in head count? I'm going to type this. And right away you might be thinking, well, how about column P and column R where we're seeing the same thing? Well, not to worry. As soon as I finish this and press enter, all those change. A quick readjustment of the column widths is going to make this a bit better. It is a reminder that we can change these. Sum of compensation, well, it's okay, but we might want to change that. I'm just going to put in comp total. And assume that everybody knows that that means compensation. And once again, maybe readjust the column width to make it a little bit tighter there. Recognize we now have, we've got 2 columns here for full-time, 2 columns for half-time, 2 columns for hourly, and so on across the top. Now, meanwhile, after having brought in that field, though, you might have noticed that in the pivot table field list, we've got status and values here. What if I bring status downward, put it below values? What happens? Now we've got, in one grouping, so to speak, we've got the salaries, the compensations, and over here we've got headcount. So we segregated the 2 lists that way. And once again, we do this, the readjusting of the columns, which gets a little tedious, I must admit. I wish that were more automatic. And another thought here, what if you wanted the headcount to the left? In other words, if you wanted these 4 columns here to the left of the 4 compensation columns. We can simply, in the values area of the pivot table field list, bring comp total downward, put it to the left of headcount. So we see it this way. And once again, we might be readjusting the columns if we wish. Now, again, I still think that the display here is not ideal, and mixing the 2 is something you might want to do, and I certainly have seen it done. And I prefer to actually have 2 separate pivot tables, but that too can get a little bit out of hand. But let's at least bring up the idea here. What if we said, in effect, why don't we have 2 separate pivot tables here? One containing headcount, one containing salary information. And maybe a third one that has something to do with job rating. In other words, maybe a third pivot table on a totally different set of combinations here. We can select a pivot table and copy it. That's what I'm going to do here. What I might do, let me do this a couple of different ways. On the Analyze tab, we can simply select entire pivot table. Control-C to copy this. I'll jump out into column X out there and do a Control-V. For the moment, we've got 2 pivot tables. Let me zoom back a bit. You can see there are 2 pivot tables out there. For the moment, identical. Obviously, the one on the right doesn't have the column that's quite adjusted, but that's okay. But in the pivot table to the right, I'm going to click on it, click within that pivot table to the right. I'm going to make a change. I want to not show the headcount. So I'll just uncheck employee name. So that pivot table is about compensation. The one on the left, I just want to make it headcount, so I'll take out the compensation. So we've got our 2 different pivot tables. And again, for the moment they have the same structure, but we could even have a third one here if we wanted to. And sometimes you think out this idea, maybe you're trying to build a presentation showing different aspects of the organization. So whether this is better than the example that we saw earlier where both fields were together, it's your call. What works best for you? But if somebody else came along and said, you know, I simply want to take a table like this and show headcount by actual building, we can do that too. Once again, we can. And by the way, instead of actually using a command, you can also just highlight the data. Press Control-C. Go to another location, press Control-V, pivot table 2. In this one here, I'll use pivot table fields. The dialog box here, and instead of showing status, I'll uncheck it. I'll drag building into the column labels. And the building site manager is probably pulling out his or her hair right now, recognizing that people in different departments are way too scattered across the different buildings here. Now, imagine these are in a campus-like interconnected setting or something like that. But again, we're bringing out the idea here that you can have pivot tables, certainly more than one, based on the same source data, but these are going in different directions in terms of what they're tabulating. This has to do with building and department. The other one has to do with the status and department and so on. Another Excel feature and a real attention, I'll say that, start over again. Another pivot table feature, and it can be a real attention getter, is this idea that when you are viewing a pivot table, sometimes you want to go back to the source data. Now, in this particular example, our source data is off to the left, but it's 700 rows, and certainly some lists are a lot larger than that. If you double-click any of these cells here, it's as if you're saying, could you extract that data and show it to me instantly? So imagine you're making a presentation and one of your HR professionals is saying, you know, I've been working with the engineering maintenance people recently. They've got 19 contract people. Gee, who are they? Double-click. And what do we have here? We're on a separate sheet. And here are those 19 people from engineering maintenance in the form of a table. We call a table layout. And all we did was double-click. That's like a snapshot in time. And in fact, what happened was, when we double-clicked this, and of course for any of these others it would work the same way, it's as if we're saying go back to the source data, find all those engineering maintenance people who are contract, and copy them and paste them on the new sheet to the left of the data. And that's what happened here. Now, if we change our source data in any way, or in certain ways, let's say, and then refresh the pivot table, what's happened to this list? Nothing. So you want to be on top of that idea. First of all, you may or may not use refresh, or first of all, you may or may not use the drill down concept that often, but if you do and you start creating different sheets out here, you better start naming them probably. You can certainly move that data around too onto different sheets, but they are not going to be automatically updated when you refresh a pivot table. But it can get your attention at times, and sometimes it's very valuable because it takes you right back to the source, even if the source is on a different sheet, as it often is, because your pivot tables many, many times are on separate sheets from the source data. So that's a powerful tool. Now, I want to again reinforce this idea about refresh in a different sense. Let's imagine we can see all the data here together. In the ADC department here, which has no full-time people at the moment, we got 3 contract people. Let's imagine that these 2 people right here have been offered full-time positions. And in our list here for ADC, we see that we've got 3 contract people, no full-time people. So what happens if we change these entries here, these 2 contract entries over in column D, we're going to make them be full-time. As I start to type this, you can see the entry there. I'll just press Control-Enter. Those are both full-time. And what happened in the pivot table? Well, based on what we learned earlier, nothing happened. We still show 3 contract people, no full-time people. So what do? We refresh the pivot table. And of course the active cell can be anywhere, and I'll just press Alt F5. Refresh the pivot table. Now we have our 2 full-time people. We used to have 3 contract people, now only 1. And again, we can see clearly here when this is happening. Many, many times, of course, particularly when you've got your pivot table on a different sheet, you're not constantly checking when you do the refresh as to whether everything is being updated. You just assume that it's working. Now, a couple of thoughts here. What if we were to add new records to this list? If we insert rows from within, and we want to be careful about that too. Can I insert a new row above row 8? I'll right-click row 8 and insert. Can't do that because I've got a pivot table off to the right. But I certainly do have the option of highlighting these rows here, highlighting these cells, I should say, and right-clicking and insert, and I could shift these cells down and then add new information here. But does that change the pivot table? No. We need to refresh the pivot table. But that's certainly one way to do this. Now, what about the other idea of maybe we've got a bunch of updates, we do it every so often. We want to add 5 new rows. So if we put in 5 new rows of data right here, what happens then? Well, of course, nothing happens until we do refresh, but does anything happen even then? No. If we refresh the pivot table, it would not automatically pick up these records at the bottom of the list. Now, that causes some people to think, well, what would we do in this case? Now, I didn't really do this. What I'm going to do, just for the sake of speed here, is take 5 of these here and simply copy these and put them at the bottom. So we've added 5 new records at the bottom. Now, I know they're duplicates, but on the other hand, let's I could change their dates or something like that to make them unique, but let's assume for the moment we wanted to add those. What do we do in our pivot table to update? Refresh will not pick up the data. Keep an eye on that 741. If I do refresh, Alt F5, remember we can go to the Analyze button and choose refresh. What happens? Nothing. What can we do? Change data source. This is on the Analyze tab, the contextual tab. Change data source. And what do we do now? We simply change the 742, which was our highest numbered row before. Now it's row 747. Now as we click OK, this will change the pivot table, and that 741 will change to 746, as we saw here. We added 5. So that's how we do that. Now, keep in mind when you do this too, and I don't want to keep that, so I'll click Undo. A lot of you know I can press Control-Z. That does the undo. That didn't take out the other records just yet at the bottom here, so I'll double-click the bottom edge of one of these cells, get down to the bottom, and you can see those duplicates. I'll press Control-Z, and I think they probably disappeared by now. Funny, it keeps resetting. Oh, not again. There we are. So now we've gotten rid of those. When you work with pivot tables, I do want to bring out too the idea there will be times when you make changes simply to the display and the layout. Control-Z is really handy, and you can press it multiple times too. Now, without going full tilt on this, I do want to bring out this idea. Some of you are familiar with the table concept introduced in Excel 2007. If your source data is a table, now this is the exact same data we're dealing with, but it's in a different worksheet and it's structured as a table. If you have converted data to a table, I think you know the idea that when you add information at the bottom, it automatically becomes part of the table. So if I even start typing a name here, I'm just going to type Wood, Larry, one of the names from above. Maybe it's his sister Mary. As soon as I finish that, before I even put in any other information, this is automatically part of the table. So if you've got a table and you add records, and you can add them at the bottom, you do have to do a simple refresh, that's all, and it will work. The simple refresh will work with a pivot table if the source data is a standard table. This is a so-called standard table, not a pivot table. So if you're familiar with that concept and working with tables, it's going to be easier when you work with pivot tables, because anytime you add records to the bottom of a table like this, a simple refresh refreshes the pivot table. All right, let's look at some other features here too. There's so many different things we can do with pivot tables, and we've only begun to see some of the amazing things we can do with not only data but also with numerical information. And ultimately, we'll be talking about dates and times here too. Another feature we haven't brought out yet too is what's called a pivot chart, and we'll show you that momentarily with some of the data we'll be working with here. This list is more like the first example we saw. It's about 500 rows or so. And we want to bring out some other issues here regarding pivot tables. There's a new feature introduced in Excel 2010 called Slicer, and we want to show you how that works as well too. So we've got a pivot table, or a potential pivot table here. This time maybe I'll go with Insert Pivot Table. And here too, maybe on the same worksheet as the source data, location, put it in cell H, actually scroll up a bit here, H1. There we go. Click OK. And let's begin with, say, clothing type, region as a column label heading, and we want to track sales. We have two other fields called year and quarter, and another one called sales type that might be pertinent here too. Now again, reminding us the things we do very often when we create pivot tables, these recommended steps to take. Design tab, report layout, outline or tabular. I do want to bring out one other difference here too between these two in this particular session here. Choose tabular and right click on the numbers, number format, once again, number, commas but no decimals. Click OK. Now, if we wanted a chart to accompany this, we could simply create a chart instantly. Now, a lot of you know that you can create a chart instantly with Alt F1, but the concern here might be Yeah, but I don't want the grand totals in here. I don't want those in my chart. They tend to distort the look of it. Maybe it would be hard to read. Fortunately, if this is a pivot table, Excel does the right thing. It only picks up this data here, not the grand total information. So let's create a pivot chart. Alt F1. It is in sync with the pivot table at all times, unlike data, which has to be refreshed. Now, I strongly recommend, too, that you explore, not necessarily choose, but explore when you have a pivot chart, in the Analyze tab there. Well, first of all, this is the Analyze tab for standard pivot tables, and we have a Design tab, but now we have a Design tab that relates to charts. Change the chart type and consider stacked column. It isn't always better, but it tends to make create a cleaner chart. Now that pivot table, by most people's estimation, I would say is not a large pivot table, and yet the chart already has some, no, I wouldn't say too much detail in it, but it's starting to get a little crowded maybe. And I'm going to make a change. First of all, I want to do an undo here, a couple of undos, Control Z, get it back to a standard column chart, a clustered column chart. Let's bring in some more fields here. Not for the purpose necessarily of clarity, but just to bring out what happens to the chart here. So I want to show the breakout here by sales type. I'm going to make this be, and notice something different here. If the chart is selected, what happens to those terms, columns and rows? They're replaced by legend and axis. That's, if you still think of them as columns and rows, fine, or if we simply click within the pivot table, we'll see those terms that we saw earlier. So I'm going to bring in sales type as a row area, and notice the chart, and then maybe year, and then maybe quarter. Now, I think without sounding too crass, that the chart is just worthless. It's unreadable. It's a mess. Let's at least consider changing it by way of the Format tab, changing it to, now I first have to select the chart. I'm sorry, Design tab, there we go. Change the chart type here to stacked column. Now, I still wouldn't say it's a great chart, but it's certainly better than what we just saw. In other words, this or this. I'm pressing Control Y, by the way, to redo. I think that's a lot better than this. Most people would agree. And again, simply by making it a stacked column. Now, I'm sort of making the case for saying here maybe that a pivot chart is not a great tool. And I think in some situations it's not. It seems as the data grows, it's not a great tool, a good visual to accompany the data. But you're going to be the judge of that and experiment with a little bit. And I think with smaller amounts of data, it certainly can be an ideal complement to the actual pivot table itself. I'm going to move this out of the way for a while, and we might come back to it. Let's focus on the data itself. And for the moment, this pivot table is, to me, a real mess. I'm just going to uncheck the box for sales in year and quarter. Yeah, part of the problem here too was the year and quarter ended up as in the values area. And what I'm going to do here differently is bring back sales and then drag year in as a row and also quarter. Notice how it ended up over here, but I'm going to move it here from values into rows. So now I have this layout. And again, without the numbers having been adjusted just yet, this is a mess, no question about it. And that chart, once again, not very readable, pretty far from it. Back to the Design tab, once again, changing it to stacked column. That is the stacked column. That looks pretty bad. So get this out of the way here. Now, part of what we're seeing here is just the idea. The pivot tables certainly have their limits. This is just way too much information, not organized in a very, very sensible way. But let's do a few things to make changes to it. Along the way, we'll introduce a feature called slicers that's going to help. I'm going to uncheck the box for quarter and year, make that a little bit simpler, and focus on the chart looking like this. And first order of business might or might not be the subtotals. Is that too much information? Does it help at all? Well, let's, even before that, readjust these numbers. Right-click any of these cells, as we've been doing. Number format, number, comma, no decimals. Okay, a lot easier to read. If we don't want the subtotals, it's on the Design tab, Subtotals, Do Not Show. Recognize the grouping here, clothing type and sales type. There are 5 clothing types, 2 sales types. Let's flip the order of these just to see if it's any better. And I strongly recommend that you probably have the sense already, don't have any fear about changing the locations of these. You're experimenting. Some of these are going to look terrible, others are going to look great, and a lot of in between. Clothing type, drag it below sales type. Probably a lot easier to read than what we saw before. Again, you're asking yourself, though, as you do this, is it bringing out the data in a way that kind of makes sense to the way I think it should? This is the breakout between retail and wholesale. You can see some significant numbers there. Is that more important than breaking it up by sales type? Now, it might be appropriate to reintroduce the subtotals. So let's go to subtotals here. And notice these 2 choices. Show all subtotals at bottom of group. Okay, there we are. So the retail is at the bottom of the retail group. And wholesale at the bottom of the wholesale group. Makes sense. Let's put them on top, though. Subtotals. Show all subtotals at top of group. And you try it, and it doesn't happen. So does the feature not work? Is there a bug in here? No, but buried in the logic, you might say, and certainly not obvious, is this fact. When you use subtotals and you want to show totals at the top of the group, you have to change the report layout to not be tabular, but to be outline form. Now, outline doesn't show grid lines either, so we'll see a change here. No grid lines, and we will see the totals at the top. So there's retail with the total on top, and wholesale with the total on top. So whatever's appropriate to you, but if you want to use totals on top, you've got to have this be an outline report layout. Now, earlier, the default was, and I could go back to it, no real strong reason to favor it though, compact form. Compact how? Well, it's not as wide. Let me undo that with Control Z. It used to go out into column O, now column N. This is compact form. It also brings back these terms, column labels and row labels. Now you can just eliminate those, but we're not seeing, although we probably wouldn't necessarily need to see right here, the generic term for that field, which is called sales type, nor do we see the region term, although perhaps it's obvious. So anyway, the compact form means this is not as wide. Again, you can try to experiment with a little bit, but you will not see totals on top in tabular form. You will see them in outline, you will see them in compact. I'm going to go back to outline again here, because I really do like to see the field names myself. There. And we see them here too. Now, somewhat obvious, but we haven't really done it, is this idea here. Here's a drop arrow. Maybe we just don't want to show everything here. Maybe we just want to show the so-called accessories. In other words, belts, ties as one category. Let's unselect them all, choose belts, ties, and also shoes. The others are dresses, pants, and shirts. Click OK. Now, as we're choosing this, it takes care of that for both types, both retail and wholesale. So we're only viewing this data. And the total here is substantially lower than before. It was somewhat, about 6 million. I'll press Control Z again to see that total. And Control Y to undo the undo. In other words, go back. So you can certainly experiment with this to see just the data you want. Now, there's another feature here too that you'd want to see, or at least explore, and I've avoided it so far, a section here called filters. Now, what if we're experimenting with this and we say, let's do this by year. I'm going to drag year into the filters area right here. And when you first put a field in the filters area, it essentially does nothing other than show the name there, because what we're seeing here in this part of the pivot table is exactly the same. We now see this up here, but we have an option. Let's just show 2012. Click OK. And so it looks like this. So that has some advantages, particularly if you have only two choices, because you can see the two. Now, an option here that's different. What if, first of all, let me go back and choose both years, all. What if instead of doing that, we bring year in as a rows field right here? Now, that makes the pivot table wider, deeper, and it's giving us a different way to display the information. Now we're seeing all the 2012 this way, and then the 2013 below it. Recognize there are minuses in front of them. You see these? This is a way to collapse data. I'm going to click the minus here. 2012 is now a single row, and we've got all the detail here this way. So without exploring all options, because it would take forever, you can begin to imagine different ways here to incorporate year into the mix here. In other words, you do it this way. I'm going to press Control-Z a few times here, rapidly going back. Now there's 2013 only. So, and there's 2012 only. A reversing stream, I'm going to go back again. So 2012 only is 3.155 million. You see it in the lower right-hand corner down there in cell 017. If I reverse direction here and show 2013 this way, we don't really see that total, do we? Quite the same way. There's 2013. Let me see it that way. And there's 2012 by itself. There's 3155. So again, just consider different ways to display this. Now, this filters area also has another thought, and I'm going to show it to you in a different way. When I used year as a filter, there were only two choices. What if we were to put clothing type there? Now, I also want to simplify this for the moment. Just take out year. Focus on this idea. Clothing type all. Okay, we're showing all clothing types here. Let's instead show by selecting multiple items first. Uncheck all, show belts, ties, and shoes. So that's just belts, ties, and shoes. Let me readjust the column width so you can see it better. So almost 2 million, belts, ties, and shoes. Now remember how we saw that earlier with the individual breakout. This says multiple items. Now, not everybody in the audience necessarily knows all 5 items. And what if it were the kind of breakout where there were 20 different variations here? Who's going to remember which ones are showing, which ones are not? Now, as the presenter, perhaps you might, but the others are not going to see that. So that certainly has its limitations. Now, there's a new feature in Excel, introduced in Excel 2010, called slicers. It's on the Analyze tab here. Insert slicer. Now, this is going to make filtering easier, and it's also got an important point to add too, and it's the idea that when you want to show less data or less information, you might also want to remind people what is not being shown. So I'm going to put in a slicer here for clothing type, region, and actually we could do these for 5 of our items here. I'm going to do all 5, which might be overkill, as you'll soon see. Now, these can be reshaped and resized. I'm going to do that, and somehow or other, I wish I could have done this ahead of time, but I really can't to show you how it all works. And I'm going to do this here. And as I'm doing this, what we're about to show you here is this idea of by simply clicking on these, we can control what's in the pivot table. And by the way, we can also recolor each of these too, if that's important, but at least that will differentiate the look of them. You want to get them probably wide enough so you don't need the scroll bar, and deep enough in the same way. And again, just moving these around. If you are making a presentation, it might be best to have these set up ahead of time so you don't have to show people how this all works. Of course, I'm doing it so you know how it works, but moving these around a little bit. Now, our pivot table field list is still available. For the moment, the active cell is not in the pivot table, but there it is. And there's that pivot table field list. Maybe I'll sort it out of the way for a bit. Now, I'm going to, on the region slicer here, choose Midwest. That's all we're seeing. Now, as you look at just the pivot table itself, ignoring the slicers, here's the word Midwest, so you see it. I want to choose mountain as well, so I use the control key, choose mountain. And we see it. Now, nowhere in the pivot table that we're looking here do we see the word year, and yet off to the right we do. I'm going to choose 2013. And what's happening now? Even though we don't see anything in the pivot table that says this is 2013 only, our slicers, and pretty clearly, I think, show what the pivot table is all about. This pivot table is showing all clothing types, data for all quarters in the year 2013, both sales type, but only data for 2 regions. And so I've got this oddity where if we click in the pivot table and look at our pivot table fields, we're only showing what? Region, sales type. Those are the 2 column and rows fields that we're seeing. And yet the other fields that are not actually being shown in the pivot table are, by way of slicers, having an impact on what's being shown. And that's almost sounds like double talk, but I think we begin to see, if you think this out ahead of time, and you really want to have this flexibility, and again, you can make this narrower and smaller and just tweak it the best you can so you don't have to do any scrolling while you're presenting this, you can begin to see how vital this is. And again, your audience doesn't always know the clothing types that are not being shown. Right now we're showing all of them, but if we wanted to show just belts, ties, and shoes, there's belts, ties, here's shoes. I'm using the control key. That's what we're seeing here. Meanwhile, this filter item that says clothing type, multiple items, is kind of worthless. I'm just going to drag it off of there. But that doesn't change the pivot table, other than to remove the area above it. So, some real flexibility here with the slicers concept. And when you have the extra time, the extra minute, and you're trying to make this look just so-so, recognize that when you click one of the slicer panels, you've got a context-sensitive slicer tools ribbon with an options tab, and you can say, okay, I want that one to be this color, and then this one to be that color, and back and forth here, and change the color of these. Obviously not the most important thing you do, but sometimes you want to do it. So different choices there. The button here, clear filter, in effect is show all of these. In other words, do not filter. And so now we're seeing all regions. And sometimes, of course, you move these around. It is a good visual, but it makes for a crowded screen. And if you still have a pivot chart around, and bring that into the mix too, when you've got a pivot chart and slicers and in the pivot table, it makes for a pretty crowded screen. But again, we're talking about the potential ability here to provide good analysis. And with the pivot chart, if done in the right way and you've refined it, you've got a good visual to accompany the data, and the slicers really help as well too. Now, another capability here, let's move into a different worksheet here, similar in nature, but I'm going to choose one called Sales by Date. And create a quick pivot table here. This time I will use, on the Insert tab, recommended pivot tables. And I'll just start with one of these here. Now this will put the pivot table on a separate sheet. Perhaps that's a slight downside of it, but there's nothing really too wrong with that. And I'm going to start with, actually I wish they had one here that showed the salesperson and the actual region, but it doesn't. But anyway, I'll start with one of these here. Looks good. Okay. I could double that too. So we're on a separate sheet here, and what I want to show instead of units here, I want to actually show the region column and bring in units sold. There we are. So nothing too unusual about this one. Once again, as we've been doing, design tab, report layout, tabular or outline, so we get those field names in place here. Now, small item, but just a reminder here. What if you were about to make a presentation of this data, and let's say we had a chart with a 2, press Alt F1, right here, and here too. Design tab, going to look better as a stacked column chart. Maybe shrink this a little bit. I'm in kind of a hurry. I'm rushed. I got a presentation in 5 minutes. I don't want to show international, so I hide column C. Now, before I do that, the total, recognize it's 13,748. So I hide column C. And if I were sharp-eyed enough or alert enough, I would have right away caught that. But I think you see the problem. We've hidden the column, and yet the grand total is not changed. And furthermore, the chart says international, and the pivot table doesn't. And if that were not enough, someone else might say, where's column C? You've got a hidden column C. So it's pretty apparent that was not the best thing to do, hide the column. But we've got the drop arrow here, just a reminder that we can use this, and actually it's above here. There we go. The drop arrow here. Let's not choose international, uncheck it, and click OK. No column has been hidden. The grand total has adjusted, and the chart does not show international. So it's pretty obvious what we would have done there. Now, we did some sorting earlier, and I want to bring out another issue here, too, about sorting that might surprise you. Earlier, we suggested this idea. We've got a list here. We might want to sort this data in descending order. We didn't have to select the data. All we did, and I'll repeat it, is simply click here. We did this earlier with the HR example. If we want to sort these rows in descending order based on what's in column F, we can simply go to the Data tab and press ZA. So that's the best total, and it's on top. Now, what we can also do, and not nearly so obvious, is to think of this data here. What if we wanted our top performing region to be in column B? In other words, take this data and rearrange the columns left to right based on what's down here. And you can see ahead of time that Midwest is going to be the leftmost column. But we need only click on one of these 4 cells. And by clicking ZA, we'll rearrange the columns left and right. This way. So left to right, Midwest, then South, then West, then East, in descending order based on what we saw in row 12. So that's really handy. Now, meanwhile, we still have international not showing. Let's bring that back. Select all. Now, when it pops into the list, it does pop into the correct place. Now, somebody else might view this totally differently and say, you know, traditionally we do this, we line up our regions east to west and so on. So let's do it this way. In fact, maybe these are in order the way we want them, but not this one. What can we do here? Just click here. Now, what we're about to do is to move all this data, but we don't have to select it all. Simply click here, drag the bottom edge, point to it, and when you see the 4-way arrow, then you can drag. So we can drag data this way. And furthermore, Lee here works closely with Ryan. Why don't we take Lee's data right here and just move this upward? Can we move that upward there at the bottom edge here? There we go. Drag that up, put it next to Ryan. Now, something happened there. It did that slightly differently. Let's try that again. We should be able to move this row up or down. Let's move Ryan downward. That should work. I'm going to drag the bottom edge here. There we go. Put it next to Lee. So now we've got Ryan Lee at the bottom. So it handles the information in different ways, but you have that freedom to move these around as you wish too, as you saw. Now, what if we wanted to analyze our data by date? Now, this is on a separate sheet from the actual source data, so we see the data entries there. This actually has date time in it. I actually went to the wrong one there. Yeah, the actual entry is date right here. What if we could break this out by month and by quarter? Well, we can do that. And so in the pivot table fields here, why don't we just, we don't need salesperson anymore. We'll take that out of the list. Of course, the chart reacts immediately. Let's bring in date. First of all, it makes for a horrible chart. And even if we use stacked, I think it is stacked maybe already, but even if, yeah, stacked already, that's terrible looking. Forget that. Move it off to the side. And furthermore, look at the detail here. Now, it does consolidate the source data a little bit because on some days we've had more than one sale, but this is certainly not anybody's idea of a compact or any kind of a pivot table, but I mean, it is a pivot table, but yeah, very useful. So I'm going to right-click one of the dates and choose Group. Excel recognizes this data as dates, and it suggests months here. Notice also it says quarters and years. It says months. Let's just give that a shot. Click OK. So now what we've got here in very short order, and by the way, the chart sitting out there in distance isn't half bad. We got a chart out there, but most important is the idea that we have a pivot table that has our data grouped by date. Totals by date. Remember, the source data is only date entries. It isn't as we see it here.
Dennis, you broke up there in the last.
That's pretty powerful and pretty fast too. What's that?
You broke up there in the last 3 sentences.
Oh, okay.
Just the last 3. If you want to say.
So, yeah. So recognize here that in very short order here, we were able to show all of that data grouped by date. But should start all over again. So we were able to show here in very little time the data grouped by month. Now it does cover a 2-month period, and for the moment our chart is looking pretty reasonable. There off to the right is stacked column chart, but we can also group this, and as we saw in the pop-up dialog box there, we can also group the data, by quarter and by year. So I don't expect to do an undo. I'll just simply right-click on one of these. I think you see here, right-click. Go back to Group, and let's group also by quarters and years. So you can pick all 3 of these or any 2 of them or any one of them. We'll click OK. And now we've got our data group. Now it's certainly a larger pivot table, but it's not that large. It's about 30 rows or so, actually a bit less than that. We've got a halfway decent chart. Maybe that's not great, but okay. And now we've got some power here to manipulate this data in a variety of ways. And notice how it does a fantastic job of pulling out our data by month within quarter within year for this 2-year set of data that we've got here. Now, as we click within the pivot table, here we have another rationale for using the filters area. Now, possibly we could use slicers again, but filters might be used here simply as a parking area to get our fields out of the way momentarily. So I'm going to drag date out of the way. Now, let's make a change here too. We've got years, we've got quarters, and now date. These are months below. Date was the original name in the source data. If we go back to the source data, here's the field called date. In our pivot table, it's still being held onto here, but wouldn't it be more meaningful if, since it's sitting above the months here, let's call it months. Now, something else you might have recognized, years and quarters were not in the original data and are not in the original source data, and yet they now appear as fields to manipulate in the pivot table field list. So this ability to do grouping is not only dynamic, but it gives us new fields to work with. Remember, our source data is not broken out by quarters, it's not broken out by years or by month, and yet we now have those fields to work with our pivot table. So this takes us well beyond the source data in terms of what we can manipulate. So if we want to make this a more compact pivot table, and maybe again we're just experimenting, let's move months into the filters area. And now we see the breakout by years and quarters. And again, I think many times you find yourself saying, I want certain information here, but yet at the same time I want to be compact. And you'll find out at different times that those objectives are in conflict with one another. You can't always have both, so it's up to you to decide. Let me bring back months again and remind you too about the minuses that appear here. Now, you can also use double-clicking to collapse. What if in these lists here we only want to focus on the detail for first and second quarter? There are two ways to do this. We can collapse third quarter, and that'll collapse third quarter on both sides, and fourth quarter. Let me see it this way. That's one option. Or we could, with the drag arrow here, only show first quarter and second quarter. Now, how's that going to be different? Right now, in the background, before I make the change, you can see third quarter and fourth quarter are represented. But if we don't show them at all, they're just not there at all. So you've got different options. So is this display better, or as I press Control-Z, is this display better? Here we are seeing the totals, but not the detail. So again, the options just keep coming at you. I'm going to redisplay this by double-clicking quarter 3. And redisplay quarter 4 by double-clicking. So you can see how to expand them that way. Collapse 2012, double-click. So it's the plus or minus you can choose, or double-clicking. I find double-clicking actually be a bit faster, and if you get used to it, it's fine. Now, there are other features that just sort of pop in here. This used to have a name I haven't seen in years. I used to call it structured selection. If I move the mouse, say around May here, we see at some point, if you move to the left side of the cell, you'll see a black arrow. So I click it. And it highlights the May data, but not only here, but also in the next year down below. So they're both highlighted. If I want special emphasis for that, I'll make it yellow maybe, or blue or something, using the on the font group in the Home tab maybe. And if I manipulate the data in different ways, what if I take out quarters and make it a filter? Put it into the filters area. You know, the yellow stays, or I bring it back. Or what if for some strange reason I bring, I want region to be a row area field, and months to be columns, and maybe quarters out of the mix for the moment. So we see this layout. Maybe not as ideal as the others, but the yellow travels with this in ways that you just would not have predicted. And we can add the yellow over here, take it out over here if we wish. Just click here and maybe remove the yellow if we wish. And again, remember to press Control-Z to undo. And you can go back multiple steps. You can go back to as many as 100 steps in Excel doing this. Control-Z undo, Control-Y to reverse string. And there certainly will be times, perhaps in presentations, where you might be using that feature just once or twice in either direction. So we've got amazing flexibility here in terms of using a pivot table for presentation purposes. And grouping data here by month, by quarter, by year certainly makes sense, and it just gives us so many more options to display this information. Now, another thought here. Maybe this group meets, they've got a biweekly sales meeting, and they've been dealing with their data over the years in a biweekly way. This breakout by month and quarter is fine, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that doing it biweekly is any better, but I'm going to reverse stream here by right-clicking on the months, going back to group, and unchecking or unclicking simply by clicking these one at a time. No control key needed here. Months, quarters, years, nor was a control needed when you selected them either. But now I'm going to choose days. Now, maybe they have a 2-week period here. So instead of grouping these by 1 day, what if I group them by 14 days? Now, getting out my calendar, January 1st, 2012 was a Sunday, so I probably want to start this on a Sunday. And I'm not sure how far the data goes. I don't remember the last day that it shows here, but I'm just going to put in the last day of 2013, which of course would be the 31st. There we go. Yeah. Group these by days. So now we've got a 2-week grouping. That covers a 2-year period, so we're talking about 50 rows here, so 52, whatever. There we are. So now we've got the grouping by 2-week periods. Each of these 2-week periods begins on a Sunday, which probably is what most people would use, or maybe Monday, but it begins on Sunday, and we've got this data for 2 years here. So that's another way to group the data. So amazing capability here for grouping information by date. And not only by date, but also by time as well. So in this worksheet here, we've got data by date, time, and we might say, let's just analyze our sales by time of day. Maybe this is a 9 to 5 operation or something like that. Can't tell from the data right away, but you can see how date and time are built in here. Let's create a quick pivot table now. Insert pivot table. This time we'll do it on the same worksheet. So we choose the option for existing worksheet, locations. I'll put this in cell H1. Okay. Let's just bring in date time right away. Click it. It's rows area field. We'll do this perhaps by salesperson. And we're tracking here. So let's say units sold. Okay. So obviously in the current display, not very useful. Let's right-click here. Now earlier when we right-clicked on this list, we did the grouping by date. Now we're going to do it by time. And how about hours? Not months, but hours. And we can see pretty quickly. Now this covers a 2-year period. It's not broken out by 1 year or another. We see the breakout, and we can see pretty quickly that we did our best selling between 10 and 11 a.m. That's the highest number we see there. And here too, a quick chart would help maybe. Alt F1. There too. It's going to look better. Design tab. So we've seen how to group data by date and also by time. You can also group data almost in like an ad hoc kind of way, on the fly, so to speak. In this worksheet here, which we saw at the very beginning of the session, I'm going to create another pivot table based on maybe regions that we don't even have. This sounds a little bit strange. Let's go to the Insert tab, Pivot Table. I'll just go with the defaults this time, start on a different sheet. And in the example here, what I want to do is show the breakout by salesperson, by region, and by items. There we go. And within the pivot table, design tab, and as we've been doing, report layout, tabular or outline form. So the questions come up, how well have we done in the East? Well, we don't have an East, but we could somehow pull together the Northeast and the Southeast. So first of all, they're not even next to each other here in our list, so why not click SE here and then drag this leftward, put it next to Northeast. So we've got our 2 East regions there, our 2 West regions here. Now, what we'd like to do is to group these. In other words, come up with the total. The total of these two is going to be 4091. So we might want to use that at times. We might want to use this breakout at different times too. But in answer to the question, how many sales have we had? How many items have we sold in the East? Let's create a new group called East by combining these two. And we can right-click on those two, Group, and suddenly the word Group 1 emerges. Let's just type right over that and call it East. Now it's got a collapse button, so let's collapse. There's the East, 4091. We brought the two together. Plus, let's bring back the detail. And surely if we did this here for the East, we probably should do it for West. So let's highlight these two, and then right-click and group. And there too, change that to West to be consistent. Now notice in the pivot table field list, we've got a new region there, in the pivot table field list, we've got a new field called Region 2. We also see it right here. That's probably not a great name. I can't come up with a really good one, maybe other than to call it East-West, but call it East-West. Probably do it that way. There we go. So we have this ability here at different times. First of all, looking at the pivot table field list, if we take region out of here, temporarily put it under filters, watch the pivot table, we've got the breakout that way. If we change our mind and get rid of East-West momentarily by putting it into filters, we've got this breakout. Or we've got them both together this way. and we can expand and collapse here with the minuses. Now, it's a little bit strange this way. Yeah, actually that way is not working so well. Let's put region below east-west. There we go. Now we got the ability to collapse this way. So it's something you want to experiment. And we can do the same thing down here too. We might want to rearrange the order here. Maybe these people, rather than working out of a central office, work out of their homes, but maybe three of these people here, maybe Willie Loman and Don Pardo here, they're in New York or something. So we'll put those names together, and maybe another one, maybe Dave Moss too. We might group these and call them New York, and maybe these three work in Ohio and these three work in California and so on. In other words, we could simply, I won't do all of that, but just take these three, and similarly as we did with dates, we right click, but this time we do a group. There's a grouping, and we'll call that's going to be our New York group. We can collapse it and expand it, or simply click here and type in New York. So that's our New York group. And so we can get a New York total, just like that. And again, we could move these around just to make it simpler, highlight these three, and do the same kind of thing. I won't do them all, but just to get you started with the concept, the idea here. This is our Ohio group, maybe. And we got another group and another group, and so on. Maybe only two in some of the groups, so on. Just different ideas to get our groups this way. And again, we've got new fields in our PivotTable field list. Now we have something called Salesperson 2. Okay, let's go back to a more standard display here. I want to do some ungrouping there, so I want to take out Salesperson 2. I can simply drag it out this way. And take out East-West 2. And talk about another way to display the data. Maybe we'd like to do some comparisons here, and there are a lot of comparisons we can get to. If you right-click within the data, you can go to a setting called Value Field Settings. Show values as percent of grand total, percent of column total. How about a percent of grand total for starters here? Actually, I think that would be the numbers would be so low, it wouldn't be that interesting. How about a percent of the row total? Okay. And probably want to change those and only show a single decimal, or maybe not even any decimals. Let me do that real quickly by right-clicking here. Number format, and single decimal, that'll make it easier to read. So, for example, these four numbers add up to 100%. And looks like nothing too glaring stands out here. These people are doing a pretty good job of spreading the sales across pretty well. But there are a couple lower numbers and higher numbers. And Ron Popeil is doing particularly well in the Northeast. And so for each person, you might want to focus on the good and the bad. Bill Babowski is doing great in the Northeast, at least in terms of percentage of sales compared to the Southeast and so on. So these percentages add up to this. And similarly, there was another setting to show who's getting the bulk of the sales in the Northwest. So once again, right-clicking here and going into Value Field Settings, show values as percent of row total, how about percent of column total, just to contrast the two. So these numbers jump out a little more readily because of the exceptions here. And so the best performer in any region, for any one region, percentage-wise, is Willie Loman, who has over 1/6 of the sales in the Northwest region. There are 12 people. So he's got, you might say, twice as much as he might have. And so on. You see the breakouts here. Different ways to display the data. And I suggest, too, explore this at depth, too, because it goes on and on and on. These choices, and there are quite a few in here. We can also, I'll do one more here, show a percent of difference from, let's base it on Willie Loman, who's our top performer. What we're now going to get are a bunch of percentages that are different from Willie Loman. And nearly everybody is underperforming him most of the time. So we can see what's going on here. Along with this, we could take this data and incorporate conditional formatting to show all those, for example, that are above 0. So Bill Babowski is outperforming Willie Loman in the Northeast by 16.8%. And we can see what's happening with the others there too. So again, the wheels start clicking. You start seeing examples like this, and you begin to think all the different things we could do here. And remember, we can have different pivot tables for sure based on the same data. And so it's not always we're taking the same data and changing it, or we're not always working off the same pivot table and making it do different things. We might be having different pivot tables here at different times. Now, there's another feature that you want to be aware of too. What if we wanted to show here, first of all, let's imagine for the moment, this is last year's data. It isn't really, but just imagine that. And what we want to show here is a projection for next year's data, a goal, you might say. We want the sales to all go up by 10% next year. So on the Analyze tab, under Fields, Items, and Sets, we want to add what's called a calculated field. A calculated field. You probably want to give it a name. I'm going to just call it goal. We're going to write a formula here based on the field names. The formula is going to be equal the items, because we're tracking items sold. We can insert that. We can actually type it or insert it. Equal items times, now if we want it to grow by 10%, 1.1. Now, if the items being sold, and we saw earlier, the items being sold are refrigerators and appliances, you can't have a tenth of a refrigerator. So we want to make sure, using standard Excel functions here, to put in the round function here. We want to make sure these are rounded to the nearest whole number. So we want to take the current items times 1.1, comma 0, which means rounded to the nearest 0 decimal places or whole number, right parentheses. Now, if you look at the numbers in the background, depending upon your math skills and so on, most of us are probably not too good at coming up with the exact numbers, except for maybe the one like 170. 10% of that is 17, so that's going to go to 187. Now, we're not going to be replacing these numbers, although ultimately we could. We want to show the existing numbers and the new numbers together. So we're inserting a new field within the pivot table. Click OK. And makes this wider for sure. And we might want to change the, it says sum of items. I might put down last year. Abbreviation. Enter. All the other appropriate columns will readjust. I'm just going to put in goal to make this be easier. Now, since that actually is a new field name, I have to put a space behind it, but that's minor. There we go. And then readjust the column widths. So for each person in each region, we've got last year, 170, for example. Here's 187. The goal numbers are all 10% bigger than the last year numbers. So that's what we're seeing here. You can see the math. We don't see formulas here, but of course we had to create a formula to get there. So it's called a calculated field. And you can imagine how we can, again, expand the capability of pivot tables by using this feature, a calculated field. Now, another thought here, too, is a capability out of the past, but something you might want to consider using, is the idea of consolidating data, using a pivot table to consolidate data from different worksheets. So, using a file that I've opened recently, here's a workbook that has 4 sheets in it. Here's the East sheet. I'm going to zoom in on each one of these so we can see it large and clear. Here's the Midwest sheet. South sheet. And the West sheet. Now, what is different about these, of course, is not only the numbers, but also the fact that they sell different items that kind of overlap, or do overlap. Couches, tables, and desks are sold in the East. In the Midwest, it's couches, desks. They don't sell tables, but they sell chairs and bookcases. Now, obviously, this is made-up data, and you can imagine a situation, though, where in real life, this is the case. Not every location sells all items. And furthermore, the way these are being sold, maybe we call this a venue or an outlet or something, but we've got in the East, it's sold through online sales, wholesale, ElectroCity, Microstuff, and so on. Midwest, we see some of the same ones, but also Great Buy we didn't see before. South has a different list. West has a different list. And just for readability, I've outlined in yellow the data that we actually want to consolidate. So in each case here, we've got this here. Now, let's consolidate these, probably on a separate sheet, although we could do it on any one of these sheets. This is an empty sheet, and I want to use this. Now, here's what you'll have to do. Oddly enough, there's a feature out of the past, Excel 2003, called the Excel Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. And what you'll want to do is actually activate that by adding a button to your Quick Access toolbar. If you right-click your Quick Access toolbar, now most people have this displayed above the ribbon, some people have it below the ribbon, but if you right-click it anywhere, you have a choice called Customize Quick Access Toolbar. And in the section called Choose Commands From, you want to click the arrow there, choose commands not in the ribbon, or all commands. This is slightly faster. Scroll through the list, you will see Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. Then click Add, and you'll see it right here then, within the list of other buttons that you have in your Quick Access toolbar. Some people have lots of buttons here, some people are just getting started maybe, or just aren't aware of the feature. They don't have very many buttons at all. But by adding this button to the Quick Access toolbar, click OK. There it is. When you click this, what you activate is the Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. And it's got a choice in it called Multiple Consolidation Ranges. Now, the way Microsoft has done this, some people have questioned, is this a clue to, in effect, say, this feature might be on its way out? The fact that they buried it in such a strange way. But nevertheless, we can get to this. Multiple consolidation ranges is the choice. Let's choose Next. And simply go with the defaults here. Create a single page for me. On your own, you might want to explore. I will create it. The page fields. Takes a bit longer. That could be a better choice. We'll choose Next. And now, one by one, we'll simply go to each sheet. I'm going to go to East, highlight the yellow cells, and Add. Then to Midwest, highlight these yellow cells, Add, and then South and, of course, West, each time doing an add. And just put it on the existing worksheet right there. There it is. Obviously, the labeling needs to be changed. Now, strangely enough here, column labels and row labels, which we've been getting rid of all the time, this time we're going to be replaced by not a very satisfactory alternative, but we'll go to the Design tab, choose Report Layout, Tabular, and it says Column and Row. So what do we call this term? What's the term for these? Venue maybe, or Sales Outlet? I'm going to put in Outlet. The term for this could be items, or the items we sell. Possibly let's put in items or item. But we are getting a breakout. This is the grand total. And by the way, a quick check here, not exactly fast, but go to the West sheet. Our grand total for West was almost 20,000. South was 13, so that's about 33,000. Midwest was 19, so that's about 52,000. And then the East is almost 12,000. So almost 64,000. What do we get here? Well, 63.7. So it is accurate. As always, we don't see formulas here, but this is accurate information. And the way we see the pivot table fields here too, we might want to do some renaming. If we bring from the filters area here, page 1, which isn't a very good name at all for us, bring it into here, put it above outlet, we're seeing this. And that's not exactly obvious what we got to do here, but instead of page 1, that's really representative of east. So we got to rename these. So you might want to pursue the other way to create this, but nevertheless, we can get the information here pretty sensible. Item 2 is Midwest, and down here South, and then West. So now we've got some better terms out there we can use. And here too, as a named pivot table, again, we move the data back and forth in different ways to come up with the display or the information in totals that we like or don't like. And as always, consider on the design tab, maybe getting rid of the subtotals and bringing them back and so on. So here we see a breakout, and this illustrates clearly where certain items are even sold and where they're not sold. And also, so I've got one item here missing. Oh, my fault. This should be called item. No, that should be called region. There we are. And this actually is east. There we go. Now it makes some sense. Now, you can do this also with data from different workbooks, although I strongly recommend when you're, anytime you're creating data from, and even with formulas, working with data from different workbooks always presents its own set of problems, so I don't highly recommend it, but you can go through this same sequence that you just saw here, combining data from different worksheets here, all from the same worksheet, from the same workbook, I should say, 4 different worksheets. We did this here from the same workbook. You can do the same kind of thing by gathering data from different workbooks. The difficulty there is, again, when you sometimes forget that you're doing that or you've forgotten that you've done it, links get broken easily. But nevertheless, this is a strong capability, and again, the flexibility here comes into play when we recognize that we don't have the exact same layout in these, and yet it works beautifully. So we've covered a lot of topics in this session on pivot tables. There's so many different things, and again, you've got to work with your own data for this feature to really come into its own. Your strengths, your knowledge of the information you work with is something that we can't really simulate in these presentations, and so working with data like this, I hope you've seen some examples that are going to help you when it comes to analyzing data. There's no feature that's faster or easier to work with, I think, than pivot tables. If you're trying to learn this off of a book or off the printed page, you might have had some issues. And I think even though pivot tables is not necessarily a difficult topic, I think it is hard to learn as you're trying to read it off the page. You got to see it, you got to try it, and don't be afraid of it either. There will be times when you make some bad choices. I made a few bad choices, and some of these not on purpose too. The idea here is you're not always sure what you're trying to get at, and yet many, many times this gives you that spark, that idea that you can come up with new, good, quick summary information in no time. So thank you all for watching.